Sometimes we must forget ourselves in order to remember ourselves. I was speaking to someone earlier this week, and this past month, as some of you might know, is Ramadan. And I am someone that celebrates a lot of faiths and a lot of holidays and part of faiths. And this Ramadan, I fasted, and I went to a Ramadan celebration. And I was speaking to someone about, I think, something that I speak to people very often about our anxieties and worries and fears and doubts and insecurities about life, about all the things that come crashing down on us at moments and overwhelm us. And I spoke to this person, and I could tell that they were struggling in their own way with this stuff. And as the conversation went on, I told them about how sometimes in life, or very often in life, we have to be lost in order to be found. It's a very Christian message. We have to lose ourselves to find ourselves. We have to forget ourselves to remember ourselves. And this person, they said, well, isn't the person that has always known themselves, isn't that person blessed? The person who didn't have to figure it out. The person who never had to get lost. I looked at this person and I said, the certainty of someone who has never known uncertainty is far weaker than the certainty of he who has known uncertainty. And it reminded me of a quote from Otto Weininger. And Otto Weininger says that, "For he who triumphs over the deepest doubt reaches the highest faith. He who has raised himself above the most desolate negation is most sure in his position of affirmation." And I said to this person, I said, the deeper our desolation, the greater our affirmation. Right? It's at the end of the dark night that dawn strikes. And earlier today, I spoke with an older gentleman, and I'd gone around, and interestingly enough, I had felt this anxiety about my life, about the things that I was doing. And I write, and I'm working on books and all these things, and I started this new job, and I'm directing my life. I'm charting a course into a direction that I find that I've selected, but also has been selected for me. But I was overcome with this inner feeling of anxiety that I'm not doing something. Something is amiss. Something is wrong. And as I investigated this feeling, a thought arose in my head, a return to something I'd been working on. I'd played with the idea of just going to some mental health places and just saying, hey, I want to come and job shadow. I want to come and intern. I want to come and volunteer. I want to come and learn more. Is that a possibility? And so I got my keys and I just left. I said, all right, well, I'm going to go to the nearest place. And I went to this mental health institute a little bit down the way, and they said, hey, we don't do that. You have to go here. And I said, okay. And as I'm leaving the building, I look across the street and I see another building, and it says Family Services. So I say, I'm going to walk in. I walk in. And to the right, there's this place with Family Services. They do community services. And I said, hey, I'd like to volunteer, and I'd like to do job shadowing. And the lady gave me a number. I took the number, I wrote down the notes, and then I went upstairs and I said, what else is in this building? Because it was this conglomeration of a lot of smaller companies and things like that. So I go upstairs and I go into one room, it's empty. And then I go down the hall and I find this place. It's called Just Dane. And I walk inside and I say, hey, I want to volunteer. Are there any opportunities? And the lady says, hey, I'll go get someone. And as I'm looking on the wall, I see these mentoring opportunities and those things. And I was like, oh, this is quite cool. But a lady comes in and she says, hey, I'd like to introduce you to one of the men that works here. And I said, that'd be great. And I meet this man, this older gentleman. And I believe that it is certainly the case that people have an energy, people have an aura, people have something that emits from them. And they emit that and you can feel it. And this man emitted something of great inner strength, you might say. A very strong inner peace, someone that had been through things. And as we sat down and spoke, he told me about his life story, about the things that he'd been through, about the Vietnam War and his life tragedies. But this was a man that had spent his life working with children in juvenile detention, and then people that had been incarcerated for decades coming out of prison, helping them adjust to new life. And there's so many messages there about forgiveness, about mercy, about not rejection, but redirection, about how life, even at its very end, even after a tragedy of immense proportions, that there is a possibility for renewal, for restitution, for reconciliation. And this man, it's very clear, and I see this in everywhere that I go, our life experiences, they shape us. They help us discover what it is that we're meant to do. And often I believe that people will say the argument is between necessity and free will. Was it the case that these events were necessary, that we had to walk down a certain path, right? That there is no free will, everything was determined. Or is it the case that we have free will and everything is just, chaotic, and we pick and choose, but those choices, they're caught up in an infinite number of choices, and ultimately, everything is relative. And people tend to be caught up between this either or of an absolute or a relative, of a 0 or a 1. But what if it was both 0 and 1? What if it was both absolute and relative? What if it was both life and death? The tree whose branches wish to reach heaven must descend its roots down to hell, right? Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche. This idea that the opposites are connected. Saint Bonaventure, Saint Nicholas of Cusa, the coincidentia oppositorium, the coincidence of opposites, the unification of opposites. There's something phenomenal there. And this man, I told him at the end of the conversation, because the thing I told that person at the Ramadan celebration wasn't something I had spoken about just to them. It's something that I had discovered in my own life, in the readings of people that I had felt and found my own soul with, I had communed with. And it was something that had been profound, something that I had discovered in my inner world. And I told this gentleman, I said, it is the affirmation that comes after desolation that transforms the world. And the message I want to share with whoever is listening here, and it may be nobody. And I think that as a note, we should say that whether or not we are heard, or whether or not we know our audience, or whether or not we are certain that we are reaching many people, is not necessarily so important. And the reason is because sometimes we create and we speak because we must. And so my hope is that for whoever is listening here, that they take hope in this fact. Take hope in the fact of the desolation in their own lives leading to an affirmation. That the periods in life where they feel lost, they'll connect. They'll connect to moments where they feel found. When things collapse, it's an opportunity to rebuild. When you die, it's an opportunity to be reborn. And on the matter of forgetting ourselves, what might it mean to forget ourselves? If we could go into that. What might it mean to lose sight? And it's very simple. It's to be caught up in something that is so overwhelming, or that is so consuming, that is so enervating, that we are unable to take note of it. We are unable to actually separate ourselves from whatever it is that is going on. And that the moment of recovery, the moment of redemption in a sense, or the beginning of the moment of redemption, is sort of a separation. Philosophy of history is a topic that has not existed for very long. A philosophy of history is an idea of analyzing history, understanding its currents, grasping its patterns, discovering its beginning and end. But philosophies of history did not begin until the 17th, 18th century. Some might say that St. Aquinas was the first, or St. Augustine was the first, but really it doesn't start with Hegel. It doesn't start until Hegel, Friedrich Hegel or Karl Marx. And then obviously today there's an entire field, Walter Benjamin, all of these thinkers in the philosophy of history. But the reason I bring that up is because even mankind was not capable of separating itself from itself to view itself as a historical process until the 17th, 18th century. In other words, mankind had to forget itself in order to remember itself, right? And that process of separation, that process of dividing subject and object, of dividing ourselves from whatever it is that we are connected to, and then viewing ourselves above whatever it is, creating that third person relationship, that itself is the process of creating our own philosophies of history. And this is what I would urge whoever is listening to begin to do in their own lives. And it's something that I've been doing for the last 2 years. And in a sense, it's mythologizing yourself. It's in a sense, making everything about your life sacred. Seeing every moment as connected to every other moment. Seeing the meaning and aiming to discover the meaning. And you may not know it. It may just become clearer over time. You may interpret it and then reinterpret it and then reinterpret the reinterpretation. However, in every single moment, you're growing. In every single moment, you're taking information and you're allowing yourself to grow. And when we aim to create a philosophy of history of ourselves, when we aim to chart out the timeline of our lives and look at beginning and end and look at the events that we've gone through, the end that obviously we have not yet reached. And we look at those events and we create these ticks and we say, this moment was profoundly important in the history of my life. I can divide elements before and after. This thing happened. My father died. My mother got cancer, something like that. Tragedies, but also I read this book. I got into college. I got a new job. Things that divide our life into its own eras, into its own epochs. And so the person who is not capable of philosophy of history would be a person who does not have the ability to divide their life into any eras or any epochs. A person who lives a life that doesn't have much novelty, doesn't have much growth. And so for the person who actually has a lot of those things, a lot of those negative things that do cause these timeline ticks, that cause these moments, and obviously all of these dark nights, there's something to be said about a life, about something being lived, about something being learned, about some growth. And ultimately, I believe, and this is my view of life, is that as we age and as we grow, our knowledge of ourselves is unfolding. But only if we willingly confront that subject-object disruption, only if we willingly confront the unknown. Because when we step into the unknown, the current of prior life is ended. And now there's a new tick, there's a new era in our philosophy of history, right? Or a new era in our history and a new event, and a new pattern, a new idea to deconstruct in our own personal philosophy of our history. And so that stepping into the unknown, into the growth, into the self-knowledge, the self-negation that's required to expand our own self-awareness, that itself is the aim of my life. To expand my self-awareness, to expand my consciousness, to expand my awareness of all things. To experience as many relations and experiences as possible, but not any and all experiences, right? This isn't to say that I should experience the experience of death before right? And so there's some logic here, there's some discretion that we use. However, it's more to say that I have lived a certain pathway in my life. And that pathway was down to the conditions of my birth, the conditions of the events that made me who I am, who I was born to, where I was born, all of these things. And everyone else has their own conditions of life. And as long as we remain in our own conditions, as long as we don't leave that amoeba or that membrane, we stay insulated and secure and comfortable. But the moment we step out, we step out into the open air. It's like a fish leaving the water, right? But that's where we discover life. We discover everything else that exists. My personal view of philosophy is that it's all contained within an idea of mental health. And you can imagine our brains as these pathways that stretch out in infinite numbers of directions. But that each of us, we have our own pathways. And then, sometimes we jump around. So we may have multiple pathways. Some of us have more or less. And every philosophy is a certain pathway, something to sort of mold or pull our brains into a certain direction. So we follow that neural network, wherever it may be, whatever it may be. A way of coping, a coping mechanism for life. And we could say that even religion forms this in a certain sense, culture as well. However, there's something to be, there's an idea, especially in the religious tradition, the mystic tradition, of not, the philosophical perspective would have us absolutize everything into one path. And it would say that, there's multiple paths possible. This is the proper and correct path. This is the right and proper, the good life, as they would say, as Plato would say. However, there is something, I believe, or at least what I believe the end aim of the brain, the end aim of the unfolding of knowledge, is the experiencing of all pathways, the unfolding of all knowledge. And self-knowledge, I believe, is the only way to learning more about others. And so my view of self-knowledge leading to unfolding of our understanding of other people, leading to these relations and this sort of ability to help, ability to embody, ability to be incarnate in the world, that leads to change, that leads to growth, not only in ourselves, but in the world around us. And so our own affirmation, or our own affirmation of ourselves after our desolations is in many ways an affirmation of the world, an affirmation of all of existence, because it enables us to assist. That growth is growth, is collective growth in a sense. And so there's a feeling of being connected to things beyond ourselves. There's a feeling of being connected to growth beyond ourselves. And I'm certain the man that I spoke to, who had assisted all these people in his life, had this feeling, had these thoughts. And he told me he'd never worked a day in his life. He said that, all of these moments, that this was his passion. That this was his passion. And his own life experiences, his own desolations leading to affirmations, his own self-negations leading to self-affirmations, he could see those connecting in the world. He could see how everything that he had done had connected, everything that he had done had assisted. And in every single moment that he was able to help, it was as if he was renewed himself, right? That feeling in your heart, that feeling of fulfillment, that rejuvenation. And so we see that the task of helping others is essentially an individual task as well. It's one that incorporates helping ourselves. It's one that means that we may have to be lost. Not may, we will have to be lost in order to be found. It's an embrace of our journey, an embrace of our philosophy of history, our life, our history, everything that has been going on. And so I urge you to look at history, look at your own history in that way, to divide your own events and elements, to look back and see how those things connected. And then you can maybe see this sort of guiding thread, a guiding hand that was leading you somewhere you didn't know you were being led. How even when you had forgotten yourself, there was a part of you that knew you better than you, that was guiding you forward. And this is kind of an idea of both necessity and free will. Periods of harvest are followed by periods of sterility. Ecstasy presupposes depression. A valley presupposes a peak. Life is an oscillation. It's an endless oscillation. It's up and down at all times. But the deeper we can go, the deeper the depths we can achieve, the higher the peaks we can rise to. And I suppose it's quite a frightening thing, because those depths are terrifying. Those depths are deadly. And those peaks are also sort of deadly too. We feel as if we're flying, we're above the world. But then again, the idea is that it's not necessarily just up and down spiral or oscillation like a sine curve. If we flip it and we add a third dimension, then we'll see that the up and down is spiralistic. And so that every time we forget ourselves and then remember ourselves, we're growing in our knowledge of ourselves. We're adding. And we can see it all connect. It's another iteration of the spiral. It's another iteration of growth. Every time we die and we're reborn, every time we renew ourselves, we're growing upward. Every imbalance that we achieve that leads to a higher balance, every instability, every insecurity that leads to a higher security, every uncertainty that leads to a higher certainty, they're necessary in our growth. We have to. We have to be uncertain to be certain. And it's only in those moments that we can look back and reflect and see the journey. Right? Because if we were always certain of ourselves, like I spoke to that person at the celebration of, right? And they had said, what about the person that's always been certain? If we'd always been certain of ourselves, would we even have a story to tell? Would we have a history to make note of? So if you are in a moment right now where you've forgotten yourself, or you feel uncertain, and you feel insecure, and you're uncertain of the path, have heart, because that means you're on the right path. As I said, we have to be uncertain in order to become certain. And the deepest desolation leads to the highest affirmation. We must die in order to live once more. Now, this is just an introduction to a new pattern or a new trend for the videos I'd like to make. I'd started a podcast, and the idea was bridge the gap. And this is essentially the same idea in a sense, bridging the gap between death and life over and over again, right? But the ideas I'd like to speak about from this point on are the ideas that are central to all of us, the ideas that we are all dealing with. And those are the ideas of our doubts and fears and anxieties of life. But I want to give those a positive valuation. I want to say that no, our experience of these negative things are not negative. They're actually necessary in a positive growth. That the things that we believe are things we should evade, the depression that we should medicate, the anxiety we should run away from, that these are actually the things we have to confront. And that these are not just the things we have to confront, but these things are necessary in our growth, that we have to disintegrate in order to reintegrate. And so, in the videos that follow, I'd like to share my own disintegrations, my own deaths, my own rebirths, my own integrations. And I hope that in sharing these things, and sharing the books that I've read, and the ideas that I've consumed, and the people that I've spoken to, the desolations and affirmations that I myself have felt, that whoever is listening will be able to take heart in their own lives and will feel a push, an inner voice, that inner incomprehensible voice that speaks in the language of God that we often run from, that is also where our deepest fear is housed. My hope is that maybe you'll hear that voice.